When we talk about fat in the human body, we often imagine it as something static, like stored luggage sitting quietly in a corner, waiting to be removed. But visceral fat is not passive storage. It is alive in a biochemical sense. It listens, it responds, it signals, and it argues with nearly every major system in the body. So when visceral fat finally begins to break down, something profound happens, not just visually, not just on a scale, but deep inside the physiology, where health and disease quietly negotiate every second of our lives. Visceral fat is often misunderstood because we are trained to think of fat as excess weight, something passive that simply occupies space. But visceral fat is biologically active in a way that challenges this simple picture. It is not just stored energy waiting to be burned, it is tissue that speaks, sends signals, and participates in constant communication with the rest of the body. It exists deep within the abdomen, wrapped around vital organs, positioned not by accident, but by physiology. From this central location, it has direct access to the liver, the pancreas, the intestines, and the bloodstream that connects them all, allowing it to influence the body far beyond its physical size. Unlike fat under the skin, visceral fat contains a dense network of blood vessels and immune cells that make it metabolically expressive. It releases hormones, inflammatory messengers, and fatty acids directly into circulation. These substances do not simply float harmlessly through the body. They interact with cells, alter receptor sensitivity, and reshape how organs respond to everyday demands. Over time, this signaling can shift the body toward insulin resistance, elevated blood pressure, and altered lipid metabolism without any visible change on the outside. A person can appear relatively lean while carrying a significant metabolic burden internally. One of the most important aspects of visceral fat is its relationship with inflammation. The immune cells embedded within this tissue are often in a semi-activated state, responding to metabolic stress as if it were a threat. This creates a constant low-grade inflammatory signal that spreads throughout the body. It is not the sharp inflammation of injury or infection, but a quieter, persistent signal that interferes with normal cellular function. Muscles become less responsive to insulin. Blood vessels lose some of their flexibility. The liver becomes overloaded with signals to produce glucose and fats even when they are not needed. Visceral fat also plays a powerful role in hormonal regulation. It influences how the body processes stress hormones, particularly cortisol. In times of chronic stress, visceral fat tends to expand, acting as a buffer that stores energy for perceived future scarcity. At the same time, it amplifies the effects of stress hormones, creating a feedback loop where stress promotes fat storage, and fat storage increases sensitivity to stress. This is why visceral fat is so closely linked to modern lifestyles marked by irregular sleep, emotional pressure, and metabolic instability, rather than just excess calorie intake. The signaling role of visceral fat extends to appetite regulation as well. It disrupts the balance of hormones that communicate hunger and fullness, making it harder for the brain to accurately interpret the body's energy status. Cravings intensify not because of weak will, but because internal signals are distorted. The brain receives mixed messages, sensing both abundance and scarcity at the same time, leading to patterns of overeating, undereating, or constant dissatisfaction after meals. Perhaps most striking is how directly visceral fat communicates with the liver. Fatty acids released from this tissue travel straight to the liver through a dedicated blood pathway, bypassing many of the regulatory checkpoints that protect the rest of the body. This constant delivery encourages fat accumulation within liver cells and alters cholesterol production, quietly increasing the risk of metabolic disease. This is not a failure of the liver, but a consequence of being continuously signaled to operate in emergency mode. Understanding visceral fat as a signaling organ changes how we think about health. It explains why aggressive dieting often fails to improve metabolic markers, and why weight loss alone does not guarantee internal health. When the body perceives threat, it does not silence visceral fat, it activates it further. The tissue responds to instability by increasing its signaling, reinforcing patterns of inflammation and resistance rather than resolving them. Seen through this lens, visceral fat becomes a biological record of long-term conditions, rather than a simple outcome of recent behavior. It reflects years of stress exposure, sleep disruption, hormonal imbalance, and metabolic strain. Its presence is not evidence of failure, but of adaptation. The body built this tissue in response to signals it believed were necessary for survival. When we acknowledge visceral fat as an active participant, rather than an inert problem, the approach to health becomes more intelligent and compassionate. The goal shifts from forcing fat to disappear, to changing the signals the body receives. Stability, consistency, and safety become the language through which the body is invited to change, allowing internal systems to gradually recalibrate and restore balance. When visceral fat begins to break down, the most meaningful change is not visible weight loss, but the restoration of communication inside the body. For a long time, metabolic systems may have been speaking over one another, sending mixed and conflicting signals that created confusion rather than coordination. Insulin would signal cells to take in glucose, while inflammatory molecules released from visceral fat resisted that message. The liver would receive constant instructions to produce and store energy, even when the body was already overloaded. Muscles would struggle to access fuel efficiently, and the brain would sense instability without knowing its source. This state is not chaos, but noise, a constant background interference that makes normal regulation difficult. As visceral fat reduces, this interference begins to fade. Insulin signaling becomes clearer because fewer inflammatory compounds are blocking its receptors. Cells that once resisted glucose uptake slowly regain sensitivity, allowing energy to move from the bloodstream into tissues where it can be used. Blood sugar fluctuations soften, not because food intake suddenly becomes perfect, but because the body regains its ability to respond appropriately. This improved dialogue reduces the need for the pancreas to overproduce insulin, easing strain on a system that may have been compensating for years. The liver plays a central role in this restored conversation. Visceral fat sends fatty acids directly to the liver, pushing it into a state of constant production and storage. When that flow diminishes, the liver is no longer forced to operate as if scarcity is imminent. It can shift from emergency energy management back toward balance, regulating glucose release, processing fats more efficiently, and coordinating cholesterol production with actual needs. This transition often happens quietly, but it changes the metabolic rhythm of the entire body. Muscles also benefit from this renewed communication. With reduced inflammatory signaling, muscle cells become more receptive to insulin and more capable of using fatty acids as fuel. Energy production becomes smoother and more flexible. Physical activity begins to feel less draining and more sustainable, not because muscles are stronger overnight, but because fuel delivery has improved. Even at rest, muscles contribute to metabolic stability by absorbing excess glucose and fatty acids rather than allowing them to circulate and cause damage. The brain is one of the first organs to sense this shift. It is highly sensitive to changes in blood sugar, inflammation, and hormonal balance. As metabolic signaling becomes clearer, mental energy stabilizes. Concentration improves. The constant low-level fatigue, driven by metabolic confusion, begins to lift. Mood regulation becomes easier as blood sugar swings and inflammatory signals no longer disrupt neurotransmitter balance as intensely. This clarity is often mistaken for motivation, but it is better understood as relief. Appetite regulation changes as well. When visceral fat interferes with hormonal signaling, hunger and fullness cues become distorted. As the interference decreases, the brain receives more accurate information about energy availability. Hunger becomes more specific rather than urgent. Cravings lose some of their intensity because they are no longer driven by metabolic instability. Eating becomes less reactive and more responsive, guided by signals that make sense rather than by confusion. This restored conversation also affects the cardiovascular system. Blood vessels respond to clearer metabolic signals by relaxing and regaining some elasticity. Blood pressure regulation improves gradually as the heart no longer has to push against inflammation-stiffened arteries. Circulation becomes more efficient, supporting oxygen and nutrient delivery without excessive strain. What is most remarkable about this process is that it does not require dramatic intervention. It emerges when the body senses consistency. Regular nourishment, stable sleep, manageable stress, and repeated movement send a message of reliability. In response, visceral fat no longer needs to dominate metabolic communication. The body shifts from defensive signaling to cooperative regulation. Over time, this clarity compounds. Each system begins to trust the others again. Energy storage and release become responsive rather than rigid. Hormones speak in proportion rather than urgency. The body does not become silent, but it becomes understandable, capable of adjusting moment by moment, instead of clinging to survival patterns shaped by long-term stress. Visceral fat responds not to force, but to perception. It is deeply tied to the body's sense of safety, shaped by signals that indicate whether the environment is stable or threatening. When the body interprets conditions as unpredictable or stressful, visceral fat tends to remain protected, even in the presence of calorie restriction or intense physical effort. This is because visceral fat functions as a strategic reserve, closely linked to survival mechanisms that evolved to preserve energy during times of uncertainty rather than release it. Aggressive attempts to eliminate fat often send the wrong message. Extreme dieting, irregular eating patterns, chronic overtraining, and prolonged psychological stress activate the same hormonal systems designed to protect the body during famine or danger. Cortisol rises, blood sugar becomes unstable, and inflammatory signaling increases. Under these conditions, the body prioritizes holding onto visceral fat, viewing it as essential insurance. Weight may drop from other tissues, but the deepest fat remains stubborn, because the body does not feel safe enough to let it go. Visceral fat is especially sensitive to stress hormones because of its dense concentration of receptors. When cortisol levels remain elevated, fat storage around the organs becomes more efficient, not less. This is why individuals can experience persistent abdominal fat even when they are eating less than before. The body is not malfunctioning, it is responding logically to a perceived threat. In this state, energy conservation becomes more important than metabolic flexibility. Safety, in contrast, sends a very different signal. Consistent meals stabilize blood sugar and reduce the need for emergency hormonal responses. Adequate sleep lowers baseline stress hormone levels, allowing metabolic systems to operate without constant alert. Gentle, repeated movement signals usefulness and capacity rather than exhaustion. These conditions do not demand immediate fat loss, they invite it gradually. When the body senses reliability, it no longer needs to maintain large visceral reserves. Nutritional adequacy plays a critical role in this process. When nutrients are sufficient, the body stops interpreting fat loss as danger. It becomes willing to mobilize stored energy without triggering defensive responses. This does not require overeating or perfection, but consistency. The absence of long gaps, extreme restriction, or unpredictable intake allows hormonal rhythms to settle. Insulin and cortisol begin to alternate appropriately rather than compete. The nervous system also participates in this shift. Chronic stress keeps the body in a sympathetic, fight-or-flight state that favors fat retention. Safety allows the parasympathetic system to become more active, promoting digestion, repair, and energy release. This nervous system balance directly influences how visceral fat behaves, reinforcing the idea that fat loss is not merely mechanical, but relational. What makes this understanding transformative is that it reframes effort. Instead of escalating control, the focus becomes reducing threat. Instead of punishing the body into compliance, the goal becomes cooperation. Over time, as safety signals accumulate, visceral fat begins to loosen its grip. Not abruptly, but steadily, responding to an environment that no longer demands constant preparedness. Visceral fat maintains a close relationship with the immune system, acting as both a storage tissue and a signaling hub that influences inflammation throughout the body. Within this fat are large numbers of immune cells, particularly macrophages, that remain in a state of low-level activation when visceral fat is abundant. This activation is not random. It reflects the body's interpretation of metabolic stress as a persistent threat. The result is a steady release of inflammatory messengers that circulate through the bloodstream, subtly altering how tissues function over time. When visceral fat begins to reduce, this inflammatory signaling softens. Fewer immune cells remain in a heightened state, and those that remain become less aggressive in their behavior. The immune system shifts from constant surveillance to a more measured responsiveness. This change reduces the background inflammation that quietly interferes with normal physiology. Cells are no longer forced to operate in a hostile environment, and repair processes can proceed without constant interruption. Blood vessels are among the first tissues to benefit from this reduction in inflammation. Chronic inflammatory signals contribute to stiffness in the arterial walls, making them less able to expand and contract in response to blood flow. As visceral fat diminishes and inflammatory pressure eases, endothelial cells lining the blood vessels regain some of their flexibility. Circulation improves, not dramatically, but consistently. Blood pressure regulation becomes more efficient because the heart is no longer pushing against constant resistance. Muscles also experience relief. Inflammation interferes with insulin signaling in muscle tissue, reducing the ability of muscles to absorb glucose and fatty acids. As inflammatory signals decrease, muscles become more metabolically responsive. They can take in fuel more efficiently and recover more effectively after activity. This improves endurance and reduces soreness, even without changes in training intensity. Movement begins to feel less taxing because the internal environment supports effort rather than resisting it. The gut is another system deeply influenced by inflammatory changes. Visceral fat surrounds the intestines and affects the permeability of the gut lining. Excess inflammation can weaken this barrier, allowing bacterial fragments to enter the bloodstream and further stimulate immune responses. As visceral fat decreases, gut integrity improves. The barrier becomes more selective, reducing immune activation and promoting a more stable digestive process. Symptoms such as bloating, discomfort, and irregular digestion often soften as this balance is restored. The nervous system also responds to the quieting of inflammation. Inflammatory molecules can cross into the brain and influence mood, sleep, and stress perception. When these signals diminish, the nervous system shifts out of constant defense mode. Sleep becomes deeper and more restorative. Emotional reactions become less reactive. The brain no longer needs to compensate for internal stress, allowing mental clarity to return. This reduction in inflammation does not mean the immune system becomes weaker. Instead, it becomes more precise. It conserves energy for true threats, rather than expending it on chronic metabolic stress. The body moves from a state of constant low-grade battle to one of readiness and balance. This shift supports healing across systems, allowing tissues to function according to design, rather than adaptation. The breakdown of visceral fat is often framed as a victory of discipline, a reward earned through control and restriction, but this interpretation misunderstands what the body is actually doing. Visceral fat is not released because the body is punished into submission. It is released when the body senses that it no longer needs to defend itself. For years, visceral fat may have served as protection, a biological response to instability, stress, disrupted rhythms, and uncertainty. Its presence reflects adaptation rather than failure, a quiet record of the conditions the body has endured. When visceral fat finally begins to break down, it is a sign that the internal environment has shifted. The body perceives consistency instead of threat. Blood sugar becomes more predictable. Hormonal signals settle into recognizable patterns. Stress responses no longer dominate every metabolic decision. In this context, letting go of stored energy feels safe. The body does not cling to reserves because it no longer expects scarcity. This release is not dramatic or aggressive. It unfolds gradually, guided by trust rather than force. This perspective changes the emotional relationship many people have with their bodies. Instead of seeing fat loss as a test of willpower, it becomes a process of restoration. The body responds not to pressure, but to care. Regular meals communicate reliability. Rest signals that recovery is allowed. Movement that feels purposeful rather than exhausting reassures the nervous system. Each of these signals contributes to an internal sense of safety that makes change possible. Visceral fat is especially sensitive to this sense of safety because it is closely tied to stress physiology. It expands when the body feels overwhelmed and contracts when the body feels supported. This is why punishment often backfires. Chronic restriction, self-criticism, and relentless effort reinforce the very signals that encourage fat retention. In contrast, patience and consistency soften the body's defenses. Over time, the need for visceral protection diminishes. There is also dignity in recognizing that the body does not change instantly. Visceral fat accumulated over long periods, responding to years of signals rather than days of behavior. Its breakdown follows the same logic. The body releases what it no longer needs when it is confident that conditions have improved. This process cannot be rushed without reintroducing threat. Respecting this timeline allows the body to recalibrate without resistance. As visceral fat diminishes, the body often feels lighter in ways that are difficult to quantify. Breathing may feel easier. The abdomen feels less tense. There is a subtle sense of internal space returning. These sensations reflect reduced pressure around organs and calmer signaling between systems. The body is not becoming something new, but returning closer to its original balance. Understanding visceral fat loss as restoration, rather than punishment, encourages compassion. It allows people to work with their biology instead of against it. Health becomes less about domination and more about alignment. When the body senses that it is no longer under attack, it responds with cooperation, gradually releasing what it once held tightly, guided by an internal intelligence that has always been working to protect rather than obstruct.